What if Atlantis didn't fall because of war? What if it fell because something was watching, waiting, quietly weakening it from the shadows? Long before the great city sank beneath the waves, strange disruptions began. Power systems failed, leaders argued, priests warned of a presence they couldn't explain. Ancient texts hint at an intelligence or an empire operating beyond visible history, a force that challenged Atlantis without ever stepping into the light. Tonight, we uncover the hidden enemy that may have influenced the fall of a powerful civilization. And the truth may be far more disturbing than a simple invasion. The silence before the storm was deceptive. Atlantis thrived in its golden age. Canals glittered, towers rose into the sky. Energy systems powered the city with brilliance unmatched. Yet beneath this perfection, something subtle stirred. It began with whispers. Fishermen spoke of strange currents pulling their boats in directions no tide should. Scholars noticed stars shifting ever so slightly, as though watched from beyond the horizon. Priests felt their rituals falter, their chants interrupted by a presence they could not name. The rulers dismissed these signs as superstition. Atlantis is eternal, they declared. No force can challenge us, but the silence carried weight. It was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of something waiting. The city's energy systems flickered without cause. Crystals that had powered Atlantis for centuries dimmed unexpectedly, then reignited as if mocking their keepers. Engineers searched for faults, but found none. It is as though the systems resist us, one whispered, as though they are being touched by something unseen. The silence grew heavier. Citizens felt it in their bones, a tension that lingered in the air. Children woke from nightmares, claiming they had seen shadows moving beneath the sea. Merchants closed their stalls early, sensing unease in the streets. Even the animals grew restless, refusing to drink from the canals. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of an enemy no one could see. An enemy that was patient, deliberate, and already inside the cracks of the city's greatness. This was the silence before the storm, and it was only the beginning. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know from where you're watching from. Atlantis glimmered beneath the sun, its canals alive with trade, its towers piercing the sky like monuments to eternity. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, subtle signs began to emerge, signs that suggested the city was not alone. Something was watching. It started with the stars. Astronomers, who had mapped the heavens for centuries, noticed strange distortions. Constellations shifted slightly, as though unseen hands were rearranging them. A scholar whispered, "The sky is not constant. It is being observed." His words were dismissed, but the unease lingered. Then came the waters. Fishermen reported currents pulling their vessels toward the horizon, as if guided by an invisible force. Nets returned empty, or worse, filled with creatures twisted in unnatural ways. The ocean, once a friend to Atlantis, now seemed restless, as though disturbed by something beneath. Animals sensed it too. Birds refused to land near the temple spires, circling instead in chaotic patterns. Horses bolted without cause, their eyes wide with fear. Even the sacred dolphins vanished, leaving the waters eerily silent. Priests whispered of shadows that moved without light, of voices heard in dreams, of a presence that lingered just beyond perception. It watches, they said. It waits. But the rulers dismissed these warnings, insisting that Atlantis was untouchable. Citizens, however, felt the tension. Merchants closed their stalls early, sensing unease in the streets. Children woke screaming from nightmares, claiming they had seen eyes staring from the depths. Families whispered of omens, of signs that the city was being studied by something beyond their understanding. The silence of Chapter 1 had now shifted into suspicion. The signs were undeniable, though no one could name their source. Atlantis was radiant, yet fragile, its brilliance dimmed by the weight of unseen eyes. Something was watching, something patient, something deliberate, and though the rulers ignored it, the people knew the storm was coming. The signs had grown too strong to ignore. Stars shifted unnaturally, waters pulled against currents, and animals recoiled from unseen forces. Yet the rulers remained defiant, dismissing whispers as superstition. In this climate of denial, Thoth, keeper of ancient wisdom, stepped forward with his first warning. Thoth was no ordinary priest. His knowledge stretched beyond Atlantis' archives, reaching mysteries preserved from civilizations older than memory. He studied Earth's rhythms, the hidden language of stars, and the balance binding all things. When he spoke, his words carried weight, but also fear. Before the council, Thoth's voice was steady, eyes urgent. "You believe Atlantis is eternal," he declared. "But eternity does not belong to us. Something watches from beyond the horizon. It weakens us from within. The silence you dismiss is not peace, but an enemy's breath, waiting." The rulers scoffed. "Atlantis has no enemy," one replied. "Our power is unmatched. Our systems are flawless. What you call shadows are imagination." But Thoth pressed on. He spoke of failing energy crystals, distorted constellations, and currents pulling ships into emptiness. He warned these were not random disruptions, but deliberate signs of interference. "We are being studied," he said. "We are being tested, and if we do not act, we will be undone before we even understand what has struck us." The council dismissed him, but the people listened. Word of Thoth's warning spread through the streets, whispered in markets, carried along the canals. Citizens began to wonder if the strange events were not accidents, but omens. Mothers clutched their children tighter, merchants closed their stalls earlier. Soldiers glanced nervously at the horizon. Thoth's warning was the first voice of defiance against the silence. It was the spark that revealed the truth. Atlantis was not alone. Something was watching, something patient, something deliberate. And though the rulers ignored him, the city itself seemed to tremble with agreement. The storm was drawing closer. The capital of Atlantis was the beating heart of the empire, a place of dazzling canals and towering spires. Markets overflowed with goods. Yet, as Thoth's warnings echoed, the city began to betray signs that something was deeply wrong. It started with the lights. The crystal towers illuminating the avenues flickered without cause, plunging entire districts into sudden darkness before reigniting in bursts of blinding brilliance. Citizens whispered the crystals were being drained, not by failure, but by something unseen. Engineers searched for faults, but every system appeared intact. "The city resists itself," one murmured. Then came the voices. At night, guards patrolling the palace heard whispers carried on the wind. Voices spoke in languages no one recognized. Some claimed they called their names. Others heard warnings of doom. The council dismissed these accounts as fatigue, but the guards refused to patrol alone. Markets, once bustling with trade, grew tense. Merchants complained of goods spoiling overnight. Scales tipped without reason. Customers vanished mid-transaction, as though swallowed by the crowd. Children grew restless, waking from nightmares of eyes staring from the shadows. Even the animals behaved strangely, refusing food, bolting without cause, or staring at empty corners. The palace itself was not spared. Rulers found their meetings interrupted by sudden tremors. Scrolls fell from shelves, maps tore from walls, and the great crystal at the center dimmed. Atlantis is eternal, the rulers repeated, but their voices carried less conviction with each disruption. Thoth's warning now seemed less like superstition and more like prophecy. The capital was unraveling in ways no one could explain. Citizens whispered of curses, of omens, of an unseen enemy that had already entered their city. The silence of the storm shifted into chaos, and the rulers could no longer deny that something was watching. The capital stood radiant, yet fragile, a city of brilliance, haunted by shadows. The unusual events were not random. They were deliberate. They were signs, and they were only the beginning. The capital's unusual events had shaken the confidence of even the most stubborn rulers. Flickering crystals, whispers in the night, and tremors in the palace had left the city uneasy. Yet what came next was far more disturbing, a force that defied every explanation Atlantis had ever known. It began with the energy systems. The great crystal conduits that powered the canals and towers suddenly surged with uncontrollable strength. Lights blazed brighter than the sun, canals boiled with heat, and machinery spun wildly without command. Engineers rushed to shut the systems down, but their controls no longer responded. It was as if the city's lifeblood had been hijacked by an unseen hand. Then came the distortions. Citizens reported seeing shapes ripple across the air, outlines of figures that vanished when approached, shadows that bent unnaturally against the light. Scholars attempted to measure these anomalies, but their instruments failed, needles spinning erratically, compasses pointing nowhere. "It is not natural," one whispered. "It is not ours." The palace itself was struck by the inexplicable. During a council meeting, the great crystal erupted in a blinding flash, projecting images across the walls. These were not maps or records, but visions, fragments of cities unknown, ruins buried beneath oceans, and symbols older than Atlantis itself. The rulers recoiled, demanding explanations, but none could be given. Thoth stood silently, his face grim. "This is the power I warned of," he said at last. "It does not strike with armies or weapons. It strikes with silence, with distortion, with forces that bend the laws we thought eternal. Atlantis is not being attacked, it is being unraveled." Fear spread quickly. Citizens whispered of curses, of enemies hidden in the depths, of powers that no priest or scholar could explain. Merchants abandoned their stalls, families fled the canals, and soldiers refused to patrol near the glowing towers. The brilliance of Atlantis had become a threat to its own people. The rulers tried to reassure the city, but their words rang hollow. The power that defied explanation was no longer a rumor. It was reality, and it was growing stronger. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its systems, once flawless, had become weapons against themselves. The silence had shifted into chaos, and the enemy remained unseen. The storm was no longer approaching. It was already here. Atlantis prided itself on flawless energy networks. Crystal conduits powered canals, towers, and palaces, eternal gifts from gods. But now, these very systems betrayed the city. What once symbolized perfection became the clearest sign that something unseen was interfering. It began with sudden outages. Entire districts plunged into darkness without warning, only to flare back to life moments later. Merchants complained their stalls lost power mid-transaction, scales freezing, lights extinguished. Families sat in silence as homes flickered, shadows stretching unnaturally. Then came the surges. Towers blazed brighter than the sun, canals boiled with heat, and machinery spun wildly without command. Engineers rushed to stabilize systems, but controls no longer responded. "It is as though the crystals are rejecting us," one whispered. "As though they are being touched by something beyond our reach." The disruptions grew more violent. In the palace, the great crystal erupted in a storm of light, projecting visions across the walls. These were not maps or records, but fragments of ruins buried beneath oceans, symbols older than Atlantis itself, and shadows that seemed to move with intent. The rulers recoiled, demanding explanations, but none could be given. Citizens panicked. Markets closed early. Families fled the canals, and soldiers refused to patrol near the glowing towers. The brilliance of Atlantis had become a threat to its own people. Priests whispered that the energy systems were no longer theirs to command. "It is not failure," they said. "It is interference." Thoth stood before the council once more, his voice heavy with sorrow. "This is the power I warned of. It does not strike with armies or weapons. It strikes with silence, with distortion, with forces that bend the laws we thought eternal. Atlantis is not being attacked, it is being unraveled." The rulers tried to reassure the city, but their words rang hollow. The disruptions were no longer random, they were deliberate. They were signs of an enemy that remained unseen, yet already inside the lifeblood of Atlantis. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here, coursing through the veins of the city itself. As disruptions in Atlantis's energy systems grew more violent, the priests, guardians of spiritual balance, found themselves at the center of whispered speculation. They had always claimed to interpret the will of the gods, keepers of rituals that bound Atlantis to harmony. But now, even they could not explain what was happening. A growing unease settled over the city. It began with hushed conversations in temple corridors. Priests spoke of dreams filled with shadows, of voices echoing in unknown languages. Some claimed to see figures at the edges of their vision, vanishing when approached. Rituals no longer held power, chants interrupted. Rumors spread quickly. Citizens whispered that the priests had angered the gods, that their rituals had failed, that Atlantis was cursed. Others believed the priests were hiding something, knowledge of an ancient enemy, a truth too dangerous to reveal, buried in their records. Inside the temples, divisions grew. Some priests insisted the disturbances were divine punishment, a warning to return to humility. Others argued the forces were not gods, but something older, alien to Atlantis's understanding. "We are not alone," one whispered. "We are being watched by an intelligence that does not belong to this world." The council demanded answers, but the priests offered only fragments. They spoke of omens, of signs in the stars. Their uncertainty only deepened the fear in the capital. Citizens began to avoid the temples, believing them tainted. Soldiers refused to guard the sacred halls, claiming they felt eyes upon them even in silence. Thoth listened carefully to these rumors. He knew the priests were not inventing tales. They were describing experiences that matched his own warnings. The enemy does not strike openly, he said. It whispers. It unsettles. It weakens the faith that binds Atlantis together. And once faith is broken, the city itself will fall. The rumors among the priests were more than gossip. They were fragments of truth, scattered and incomplete, pointing toward a presence that had already infiltrated Atlantis. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was inside the temples, inside the hearts of those sworn to protect the city's soul. The rumors among the priests had unsettled the capital. But the true terror lay not within the temples. It stretched far beyond the city's walls, into the horizon itself. For centuries, Atlantis had believed the ocean was its ally, a vast expanse that carried trade, power, and influence across the world. But now, the horizon no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Sailors were the first to notice. They spoke of currents that pulled their ships toward unseen destinations, of waves that rose without wind, and of shadows that moved beneath the surface. Some claimed to see lights flickering far out at sea, glowing patterns that vanished when approached. Others swore they heard voices carried on the tide, whispers that echoed across the water. Explorers returned with stories of strange phenomena. Compasses spun wildly, maps became useless, and stars shifted in ways that defied navigation. It is as though the horizon itself resists us, one captain confessed, as though something waits just beyond sight, watching every move we make. The council dismissed these accounts as superstition, but the people listened. Merchants refused to send ships beyond the capital's harbors, fearing they would vanish into the unknown. Fishermen abandoned their routes, claiming the sea had turned hostile. Even the sacred dolphins, once symbols of Atlantis's bond with the ocean, disappeared from the canals, leaving the waters eerily silent. Thoth studied these reports with grim intensity. He knew the horizon was not empty. It was a veil. Something waits beyond, he warned. It does not strike openly, but it observes. It tests. The ocean is no longer ours. It belongs to something older, something hidden. The presence beyond the horizon was not seen, but it was felt. It was patient, deliberate, and vast. It did not need armies or weapons. Its silence was enough to unravel the confidence of Atlantis. Citizens whispered of an ancient enemy, a force that had always existed but had never revealed itself. The horizon, once a symbol of opportunity, had become a boundary of fear. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance was now shadowed by the knowledge that something immense and unseen lingered just beyond reach. The storm was no longer confined to the capital. It stretched outward, across the seas, waiting for the moment to strike. The horizon had grown restless, the seas alive with whispers and distortions. Yet the greatest revelation did not come from the waters. It came from the archives of Atlantis itself, deep within the capital's library, beneath layers of sealed chambers and forgotten scrolls. Scholars uncovered records that spoke of a stranger, a figure who had appeared in ages long before Atlantis rose to power. The discovery began innocently. A group of archivists, searching for explanations to the disruptions, stumbled upon a collection of tablets hidden behind walls of stone. Their inscriptions were older than the city itself, written in a language that even the most skilled scholars struggled to decipher. But one phrase repeated across the fragments: "The Watcher waits." The records described a presence that had haunted civilizations before Atlantis. It was not a conqueror, nor a god, but something that lingered in silence, weakening societies from within until they collapsed. The stranger was never seen directly, only felt through distortions in the stars, disruptions in energy, and whispers carried on the wind. Thoth studied the tablets with grim recognition. "This is not new," he said. "Atlantis is not the first to face this enemy. Others have fallen before us, their names erased, their cities swallowed. We are only the latest to be tested." The council resisted the implications. "Atlantis is eternal," they repeated, though their voices trembled. "No stranger can undo us." But the people listened. Word of the record spread quickly, whispered in markets, carried along canals, and repeated in temples. Citizens began to wonder if their city's brilliance was not a gift, but a lure, a beacon that had drawn the attention of something ancient. The stranger in the records was described as patient, deliberate, and vast. It did not strike openly. It did not need armies or weapons. It simply waited, unraveling civilizations until they collapsed under their own weight. The revelation shook Atlantis to its core. The disruptions were no longer seen as random accidents, but as deliberate signs of a presence that had haunted humanity for ages. The silence was not empty. It was the breath of the Watcher. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance was now shadowed by the knowledge that it was not the first to face this enemy. And if the records were true, it would not be the last. Atlantis had always believed its technology was eternal. Crystal conduits, shimmering towers, machines harnessing ocean energy, all were said to be flawless, gifts of divine wisdom. But now, these systems began to fail without reason, leaving the city vulnerable in ways no one could explain. It started with transport networks. Levitating platforms froze mid-air, stranding passengers above canals. Some dropped without warning, crashing into the waters below. Engineers rushed to investigate, but mechanisms showed no damage. "It is not broken," one whispered. "It simply refuses to obey." Then came communication crystals. Messages between districts vanished, replaced by static or distorted voices. Voices that spoke in languages no one recognized. Priests claimed these voices were warnings, while scholars argued interference. But no one could deny that Atlantis's lifeline of communication had been compromised. The failures spread quickly. Agricultural machines stopped functioning, leaving crops to wither. Water purification systems turned bitter, poisoning entire districts. Even the great defensive shields that protected the capital flickered, leaving the city exposed. The rulers demanded answers, but their engineers and scholars could only shrug in despair. "There is no cause," they said. "The systems fail as though rejecting us." Citizens panicked. Families abandoned their homes, fearing collapse. Merchants refused to trade, claiming their scales and devices no longer worked. Soldiers hesitated to patrol, knowing their weapons might fail at the moment of need. Atlantis, once radiant, now stood fragile, betrayed by the very systems it had trusted. Thoth spoke once more, his voice heavy with sorrow. "This is not failure," he said. "It is interference. The enemy does not strike with armies. It strikes by unraveling what we believe eternal. Atlantis is not being conquered. It is being dismantled from within." The rulers tried to reassure the city, but their words rang hollow. The failures were undeniable, the cause invisible. Technology, once flawless, had become a weapon against its own people. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance was now shadowed by the knowledge that its greatest pride had turned against it. The storm was no longer silent. It was tearing the city apart, piece by piece. Atlantis's brilliance was unraveling in public view. Crystals failing, machines collapsing, whispers haunting the streets. But the most dangerous fractures were not visible to the citizens. They were hidden behind the marble doors of the council chamber, where the rulers of Atlantis began to turn against one another. The council had always projected unity, embodying the eternal strength of the empire. Yet, as disruptions grew, their voices sharpened, meetings devolving into accusations and paranoia. Some insisted the failures were sabotage from within, pointing fingers at rival factions. Others claimed priests were spreading fear to seize power. A few, shaken by Thoth's warnings, whispered the enemy was not human. Behind closed doors, alliances fractured. Secret meetings were held in shadowed corridors, where rulers plotted against one another. Fearing betrayal more than the unseen enemy, documents vanished from archives. Reports were altered. Evidence of disruptions was buried to protect reputations. Atlantis must appear eternal. One ruler declared, "If the people see weakness, the city will collapse before the enemy even strikes." But the secrecy only deepened the crisis. Engineers were silenced when they reported anomalies. Priests were forbidden from speaking of omens. Soldiers were ordered to patrol in silence, their fears dismissed as weakness. The truth was hidden, but the silence inside the council chamber was louder than the chaos outside. Thoth watched these divisions with sorrow. He knew the enemy did not need to strike openly. The Watcher does not conquer with armies, he warned. It conquers by breaking trust, by turning rulers against one another, by making secrecy more dangerous than truth. The hidden conflict spread like poison. Citizens sensed the tension, though they did not know its source. Rumors of betrayal filled the streets, whispers of rulers plotting against each other. The brilliance of Atlantis was dimming, not only from failing systems, but from the collapse of unity at its core. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its leaders, once symbols of strength, had become prisoners of fear. Behind closed doors, the storm was already tearing the empire apart. Behind the marble walls of the council chamber, a hidden conflict fractured Atlantis's rulers. Fear now consumed the elite circle. Whispers of sabotage, tech failures, and priestly omens combined into a paranoia, spreading like fire. The elite lived in glittering palaces, commanding respect. Yet, in private, they were restless. Some refused sleep, convinced shadows lingered. Guards trembled at unseen eyes. Meetings devolved into silence, rulers staring, each suspecting the other of betrayal. Rumors spread like poison. One faction believed priests betrayed Atlantis, aligning with outside forces. Another accused engineers of tampering with systems, weakening the city from within. A third whispered Thoth himself was the danger, his warnings designed to sow fear and seize control. Paranoia grew unbearable. Rulers hoarded information, hiding failures and silencing dissent. Trust collapsed. The elite, once united, became frightened individuals, guarding secrets, suspecting betrayal. Thoth watched this unraveling with sorrow. He knew the enemy had already succeeded. "The Watcher does not conquer with armies," he said quietly. "It conquers by breaking trust. It turns rulers into prisoners of their own fear." Atlantis is not being attacked. It is being hollowed from within. The elite circle became a mirror of the city itself, radiant on the outside, fragile within. Their fear spread outward, infecting the people. Citizens sensed the tension. Whispers of betrayal filled the streets, rumors of rulers plotting against one another. The brilliance of Atlantis dimmed, not only from failing systems, but from the collapse of unity. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its leaders, once symbols of strength, had become shadows of fear, and in their silence, the unseen enemy grew stronger. The elite circle of Atlantis had been consumed by fear, their unity shattered by paranoia. Yet even in their secrecy, one truth became undeniable. The city was unraveling, and the enemy remained unseen. Desperation drove them to a single course of action. They would attempt to identify the source. The council summoned scholars, engineers, and priests into the palace chamber, demanding answers. Scrolls were unsealed, maps unfurled, and instruments recalibrated. Every anomaly was catalogued: the failing crystals, the distorted constellations, the whispers in the night. "We must know what hunts us," one ruler declared. "If we cannot name it, we cannot fight it." The scholars turned to the stars. They charted the heavens, searching for patterns in the distortions. What they found was unsettling. Constellations shifted in ways that suggested intelligence, as though the sky itself was being rearranged by design. "It is not random," one whispered. "It is deliberate." The engineers studied the energy systems. They dismantled conduits, examined crystals, and tested machinery. Yet every failure defied explanation. The systems were intact, flawless in design, but they refused to obey. "It is as though they are rejecting us," an engineer confessed. "As though they are being touched by something beyond our reach." The priests turned to their rituals, seeking guidance from the gods. But their chants faltered, their visions clouded. Instead of divine answers, they saw shadows moving across their temples, figures that vanished when approached. "It is not the gods," one priest admitted. "It is something older, something that watches." Thoth listened to every report, his face grim. "You search for a name," he said, "but the enemy does not reveal itself. It does not strike openly. It does not need to. It weakens us from within, turning our brilliance into fragility." Atlantis is not being attacked. It is being studied. The council recoiled at his words, but they could not deny the evidence. The source remained elusive, yet its presence was undeniable. The city's systems, its stars, its temples, all bore the mark of interference. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its rulers had attempted to identify the source, but what they found was not a name, nor a face, but a truth more terrifying. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The storm was tightening its grip. The council had tried to identify the source, but their efforts yielded only fragments of truth. The enemy remained unseen, its presence everywhere and nowhere. Yet the ocean, the very lifeblood of Atlantis, began to speak in ways no one could ignore. It started with the fishermen. Nets cast into the waters returned not with fish, but with strange objects. Shards of stone carved with symbols no Atlantean recognized. Fragments of metal that pulsed faintly with light, and shells etched with markings that seemed deliberate. "The sea is sending us messages," one whispered. But from whom? Then came the sounds. At night, sailors reported hearing low vibrations rising from the depths. Resonances that shook the hulls of their ships. Some claimed the vibrations formed patterns, almost like language. Others swore they heard voices calling their names, echoing across the waves. The ocean, once a friend, had become a messenger of dread. Priests gathered at the canals, listening to the waters. They claimed to hear chants woven into the currents, warnings of collapse, whispers of civilizations swallowed long before Atlantis. The depths remember, one priest said. They speak of enemies older than the gods. Scholars attempted to study the phenomena, lowering instruments into the sea. But their devices malfunctioned, compasses spun wildly, and crystals shattered under pressure. What little data they recovered revealed patterns too precise to be natural, signals that suggested intelligence. It is not the ocean itself, one scholar murmured. It is something within it, something that uses the sea as its voice. Thoth listened with grim recognition. The Watcher does not strike openly, he said. It whispers, it unsettles, it speaks through the depths, reminding us that we are not alone. These are not accidents, they are messages, and they are meant for us. The people grew restless. Families refused to live near the canals, fearing the waters would rise against them. Merchants abandoned trade routes, claiming the ocean had turned hostile. Even the sacred dolphins, once symbols of Atlantis's bond with the sea, had vanished completely. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. The depths had begun to speak, and their messages carried a truth too terrifying to ignore. The enemy was not only watching, it was communicating. The storm was no longer silent. It had found its voice in the ocean itself. Atlantis had endured whispers, distortions, and failures. Yet, despite the chaos, its rulers clung to the illusion of control. They believed the disruptions were temporary, that their brilliance could withstand any storm. But then came the moment when control began to slip, a moment that revealed the empire's fragility in ways no one could deny. It began in the heart of the capital. The great crystal conduits, once steady and eternal, surged violently, flooding the canals with waves of uncontrolled energy. Bridges collapsed, towers flickered, and entire districts were plunged into chaos. Citizens fled into the streets, their voices rising in panic as the city's lifeblood turned against them. The council rushed to respond, but their commands carried no weight. Engineers reported that the systems no longer obeyed. Priests admitted their rituals failed, and soldiers confessed their weapons had grown unreliable. Every attempt to restore order only deepened the chaos. "It is not ours anymore," one engineer whispered. "The city itself resists us." Markets fell silent. Merchants abandoned their stalls, fearing the towers would collapse. Families huddled in darkness, listening to the hum of crystals that pulsed like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Even the animals fled, their instincts sensing what humans refused to admit. Atlantis was losing control. Inside the palace, the rulers argued bitterly. Some demanded harsher measures, others called for secrecy, and a few whispered that the city was already doomed. Thoth stood among them, his voice steady but grim. "This is the moment I warned of," he said. "Control is slipping. The Watcher does not strike with armies. It strikes by unraveling our grip on the systems we believed eternal. Atlantis is not being attacked. It is being undone." The words carried weight, but the rulers refused to accept them. They clung to denial, insisting Atlantis was eternal. Yet outside the palace walls, the truth was undeniable. The city's brilliance had become its weakness, its systems no longer serving its people but betraying them. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. The moment control began to slip was not a single event. It was the realization that the Empire's grip on stability was gone. The storm was no longer approaching. It had taken hold, and Atlantis was powerless to stop it. The moment control slipped from Atlantis's grasp, fear spread like wildfire. But fear alone was not the city's undoing. It was the division that followed. The Empire, once united under a single vision of eternity, began to fracture from within. The council, already consumed by secrecy, now turned openly against itself. Accusations flew across the chamber. Priests were blamed for failing rituals, engineers accused of sabotage, and scholars condemned for spreading panic. Every faction sought to protect its own reputation, even if it meant tearing down others. The unity that had once defined Atlantis was gone. In the streets, paranoia seeped into daily life. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, convinced betrayal lurked behind every door. Families whispered of spies, merchants accused rivals of conspiring with unseen forces, and soldiers refused to trust their commanders. The brilliance of Atlantis dimmed, not from external attack, but from the collapse of trust within its own walls. Priests, once revered, became targets of anger. Citizens claimed they had hidden truths, that their rituals had failed. Temples were vandalized, chants interrupted by shouts of rage. Engineers fared no better, accused of deliberately weakening systems. The paranoia reached the elite circle. Rulers refused to meet in person, fearing assassination. Messages were delivered through intermediaries, each word weighed with suspicion. Some began to hoard resources. Others plotted alliances in shadowed corridors, convinced that survival depended on betrayal. Thoth watched this descent with sorrow. The Watcher does not need armies, he said. It only needs fear. Once trust is broken, Atlantis will destroy itself. His words carried truth, but few listened. The city was too consumed by suspicion, too fractured to hear. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance was now shadowed by paranoia, its unity shattered by division. The enemy had not struck openly, yet it had succeeded. The storm was no longer outside the walls. It was inside the hearts of the people. And with every whisper, every accusation, Atlantis drew closer to collapse. The paranoia that consumed Atlantis had fractured its unity, but the greatest shock came not from fear. It came from discovery. Deep beneath the archives, hidden in chambers sealed for centuries, scholars unearthed evidence. Atlantis was not the first great empire. There had been another, older civilization, erased from memory, yet leaving behind fragments that whispered of its existence. It began with a collapse in subterranean vaults. Engineers stumbled upon a chamber carved in stone, unlike any Atlantean design. Its walls were etched with symbols older than the city itself, markings that pulsed faintly as though alive. Within the chamber lay artifacts, tools of unknown purpose, fragments of crystal resonating with strange energy, and tablets. The scholars were stunned. These relics did not belong to Atlantis. They belonged to something older, something forgotten. "This is not our work," one whispered. "It predates us. It predates everything we know." Thoth examined the artifacts with grim recognition. The symbols matched fragments he had seen in ancient records, civilizations swallowed by silence. "We are not the first," he said. "Others built wonders greater than ours, and they fell not by war, but by the same presence that now watches us." The revelation spread quickly. Citizens whispered that Atlantis's brilliance was not unique. but borrowed. Priests claimed the gods had hidden these ruins as warnings. Merchants feared the city was cursed, built upon the bones of a forgotten empire. Soldiers, once confident, now trembled at the thought that Atlantis was merely repeating a cycle of collapse. The council tried to suppress the discovery, sealing the chamber and forbidding discussion, but the truth had already escaped. The evidence of an older civilization was undeniable, and it carried a terrifying implication. Atlantis was not facing its first enemy. It was facing an ancient force that had destroyed others before it. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its pride was shattered by the knowledge that it was not eternal, but part of a cycle of rise and ruin. The storm was no longer a mystery, it was history repeating itself. And the enemy had already proven it could win. The discovery of an older civilization had shaken Atlantis to its core. Evidence suggested others had risen before them, only to fall to the same unseen force. Now, the rulers demanded clarity. They wanted the enemy revealed, named, and confronted. But what they found was not certainty. It was a deeper mystery. It began with a vision. During a council meeting, the great crystal at the chamber's center erupted in a storm of light, projecting images across the walls. Shadows formed into shapes, towering figures with eyes that glowed like fire. Voices that resonated through the chamber, though no mouth spoke. The rulers recoiled, convinced they were seeing the enemy at last. "It is here," one whispered. "The Watcher has revealed itself." But the vision was fleeting. The figures dissolved into fragments, leaving only symbols etched in light, markings identical to those found in the ruins of the older civilization. Scholars scrambled to interpret them, but the symbols shifted constantly, refusing to hold meaning. "It is not a revelation," one murmured. "It is a test." Priests claimed the vision was divine punishment, proof that Atlantis had angered the gods. Engineers argued it was interference, a manipulation of the crystal systems. Thoth, however, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the fading symbols. When he finally spoke, his words carried weight. "You believe you have seen the enemy," he said. "But what you saw was not truth, it was a reflection. The Watcher does not reveal itself. It shows us only what we fear." The council erupted in argument. Some insisted the enemy had been revealed. Others claimed it was deception. Citizens, hearing of the vision, panicked. Rumors spread that the Watcher had entered the palace, that it had shown its face, that Atlantis was already doomed. But the truth was more elusive. The vision had not revealed the enemy. It had deepened the mystery. The Watcher remained unseen, its presence everywhere and nowhere, its power undeniable, yet impossible to define. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its rulers believed they had glimpsed the enemy, but what they saw was only a shadow, a fragment, a question without an answer. The storm was no longer about revelation. It was about deception, and Atlantis was caught in its web. The illusions of revelation had left Atlantis shaken, but the true devastation came when the city's systems finally broke beyond repair. The collapse was not sudden. It was triggered, piece by piece, until the empire's brilliance crumbled under its own weight. It began with the canals. Once the lifeblood of Atlantis, they surged uncontrollably, flooding districts and sweeping away homes. Bridges cracked, markets drowned, and families fled to higher ground. The waters, once symbols of prosperity, had turned against the city. Then the towers fell. Crystals that had illuminated the capital for centuries erupted in violent bursts of light, shattering into fragments. Fragments rained down upon the streets. Entire districts were plunged into darkness, their brilliance extinguished in an instant. Citizens screamed as the structures they trusted collapsed around them. The palace itself was not spared. The great crystal at its center, the heart of Atlantis's power, flickered violently before dimming to silence. The council chamber shook, scrolls and maps scattering across the floor. Rulers clung to denial, but their voices trembled. Atlantis is eternal, they repeated, though eternity had already slipped away. The collapse spread outward. Communication crystals failed, leaving districts isolated. Agricultural systems withered, food supplies dwindled, and defensive shields flickered into nothingness. Soldiers abandoned their posts, priests fell silent, and merchants fled the city. The empire's lifeblood had been severed. Thoth stood among the chaos, his voice steady though sorrowful. "This is the moment I warned of," he said. "The Watcher does not conquer with armies. It conquers by unraveling what we believe eternal. Atlantis is not being attacked. It is being undone." Citizens wept in the streets, their faith shattered. The brilliance of Atlantis had become its downfall, its pride transformed into fragility. The collapse was no longer a threat, it was reality. Atlantis stood radiant yet broken. The storm had triggered its fall, and the empire that believed itself eternal was crumbling before its own eyes. Atlantis had fallen, its canals flooded, its towers shattered, its brilliance undone by forces unseen. The Watcher had not struck with armies or weapons, but with silence, distortion, and fear. And when the empire collapsed, it left behind not only ruins, but a question that echoes even now. The survivors whispered it as they fled the capital. Scholars inscribed it in fragments of stone. Priests carried it into their chants. Thoth himself, standing among the wreckage, spoke it aloud. Why did Atlantis fall? Was it arrogance, the belief that brilliance was eternal? Was it betrayal, the rulers consumed by secrecy and paranoia? Was it interference, an enemy older than the gods, unraveling civilizations one by one? Or was it all of these, woven together into a cycle that no empire could escape? The ruins of Atlantis became a warning. Generations that followed studied its collapse, searching for answers. They searched in fragments of crystal, in symbols etched upon stone, in whispers carried by the ocean. Yet the truth remained elusive. The Watcher never revealed itself, never claimed victory, never left a name. It simply lingered, patient and silent, as it had for civilizations before. And so the question remains today. Was Atlantis destroyed by an enemy beyond comprehension, or by the fragility within itself? Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance became its downfall, its pride transformed into ruin. The storm passed, but the silence endured. The empire is gone, but the question endures. A reminder that no civilization, no matter how eternal it believes itself to be, is beyond collapse. Good night.